As to the error committed in the name and designation of him who is now familiarly known to Freemasons as Hiram Abiff, a sufficient explanation has been given in a preceding chapter. We next have an account of the travels of these masons or architects who built the temple into various countries to acquire additional knowledge and experience and to disseminate the principles of their art. The carelessness of chronology, to which I have already adverted, so peculiar to the general illiteracy of the age, has led legendists to connect this diffusion of architecture among the various civilized countries of the world with the Tyrian and Jewish Masons, but the wanderings of that body of builders known as the traveling Freemasons of the Middle Ages through all the kingdoms of Europe, and their labors in the construction of cathedrals, monasteries, and other public edifices are matters of historical record. Thus the historical idea is well preserved in the legend of a body of artists who wandered over Europe and were employed in the construction of cathedrals, monasteries, and other public edifices. The legend next recounts the introduction of architecture into France, and the influence exerted upon it by Grecian architects, who brought with them into that kingdom principles of Byzantine art. These are facts which are sustained by history. Prominence given to France above Spain or Italy or Germany is, I think, merely another proof that the legend was of French origin, was constructed under French influence. The account of the condition of masonry or architecture among the Britons in the time of St. Alban, or the 4th century, is simply a legendary version of the history of the introduction of the art of building into England during the Roman domination by the Collegia Artificum, or Roman colleges of artificers, who accompanied the victorious legions when they vanquished Hesperia, Gaul, and Britain, and colonized as they vanquished them. The decay of architecture in Britain after the Roman armies had abandoned that country to protect the empire from the incursions of the northern hordes of barbarians, in consequence of which Britain was left in an unprotected state and was speedily involved in wars with the Picts, the Danes, and other enemies, is next narrated in the legend and is its version of an historical fact. It is also historically true that in the 7th century peace was restored to the northern parts of the island, and that Edwin, king of Northumbria, of which the city of York was the capital, revived the arts of civilization, gave his patronage to architecture, and caused many public buildings, among others the Cathedral of York, to be built. All of this is told in the legend, although, by an error for which I have already accounted, Edwin, the Northumbrian king, was in the later legend confounded with the brother of Ethelstan. The second decay of architecture in England, in consequence of the invasions of the Danes and the intestine as well as foreign wars, which desolated the kingdom until the reign of Ethelstan, in the early part of the 10th century, when entire peace was restored, is briefly alluded to in the legend, therein conforming to the history of that troublous period. As a consequence of the restoration of peace, the legend records the revival of masonry or architecture in the 10th century under the reign of Ethelstan, who called the craft together and gave them a charter. I have already discussed this point and shown that the narrative of the legend presents nothing improbable or incredible, but that it is easily to be reconciled with the facts of contemporary history. We have only to reconcile the two forms of the legend by asserting that Edwin of Northumbria revived Masonry in an assembly convened by him at York, and that Athelstan restored its decayed prosperity by his general patronage and by charters which he gave to the guilds or corporations of handicraftsmen. Passing in this summary method over the principal occurrences related in this legend of the craft, we relieve it from the charge of gross puerility which has been urged against it, even by some Masonic writers who have viewed it in a spirit of immature criticism. We find that its statements are not the offspring of a fertile imagination or the crude inventions of sheer ignorance, but that, on the contrary, they really have a support in what was at the time accepted as authentic history, and whose authenticity cannot, even now, be disproved or denied. Dissected as it has here been by the canons of philosophical criticism, the legend of the craft is no longer to be deemed a fable or myth, but an historical narrative related in the quaint language and in the quainter spirit of the age in which it was written. But after the revival of Freemasonry in the beginning of the 18th century, this legend, for the most part misunderstood, served as a fundamental basis on which were erected, first by Anderson and then by other writers who followed him, expanded narratives of the rise and progress of Masonry, in which the symbolic ideas or the mythical suggestions of the ancient legend were often developed and enlarged into statements, for the most part, entirely fabulous. In this way, these writers, who were educated and even learned men, have introduced not so much any new legends, but rather theories founded on a legend, by which they have traced the origin and the progress of the institution in narratives without historic authenticity and sometimes contradictory to historic truth. The mode in which these theories have been attempted to be supported by the citation of assumed facts have caused them to take, to some extent, the form of legends. But to distinguish them from the pure legends which existed before the 18th century, I have preferred to call them theories. Their chief tendency has been, by the use of unauthenticated statements, to confuse the true history of the order. And yet they have secured so prominent a place in its literature and have exerted so much influence on modern Masonic ideas that they must be reviewed and analyzed at length in order that the reader may have a complete understanding of the legendary history of the institution. For of that legendary history, these theories, founded as they are on assumed traditions, constitute a part. As having priority in date, the theory of Dr. Anderson will be the first to claim our attention.